The sky above Germany in late 1943 was a graveyard in the making. High over the Reich, American bombers droned eastward, great silver fortresses bristling with guns but flown by crews who had logged only a handful of combat missions. In their gun sights waited men who had fought since Poland and France, hardened aces of the Luftwaffe, with kill scores that rivaled entire squadrons. To them, these young Americans looked like easy prey. Radio chatter crackled with confidence. Aces smirked as they pushed their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs into attack runs. They had seen it all before, rookie G.I.s fumbling formation changes, breaking discipline under fire, leaving gaps wide enough for a cannon burst to rip a bomber apart. October 1943 had proven their point on Black Thursday. Nearly 60 flying fortresses had gone down in flames, whole crews swallowed by smoke and steel. For a moment it seemed the skies of Europe would remain German forever. And then the horizon began to change. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's seasoned hunters looked up and froze. Contrails crossed and layered until the heavens were painted white. Hundreds of American fighters, sleek, fast, relentless, soared alongside the bombers, stretching as far as the eye could see. P-51 Mustangs with long-range tanks now escorted their prey all the way to Berlin. What had once been a desperate gamble now became an overwhelming tide. The Smirks disappeared. "Sie sind überall," one German pilot whispered into the radio. "They are everywhere." This is the story of how arrogant laughter turned into stunned silence. How rookie G.I.s, backed by the vast might of American industry, filled the skies with such numbers and fury that even the proudest Luftwaffe aces could not believe their eyes. In the dark winter of 1942, when the first formations of American bombers arrived in Britain, few in the Reich Air Ministry lost sleep. To the Luftwaffe aces it seemed laughable. The United States had been at war for barely a year. Its pilots were fresh from training schools in Texas and California, their logbooks filled with fair-weather exercises, not desperate combat over Europe. By contrast, Germany's fighter elite had honed their craft since Spain, Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. Many had survived thousands of sorties, some boasting victory tallies of 5,0,1,0,0, even 200 kills. They embodied the very mythology of the Experten warriors who believed that individual skill and ruthless efficiency could bend the outcome of the war. Yet those first rookie crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force carried something far more dangerous than experience. They carried America's industrial promise. Behind every B-17 flying fortress parked on the damp runways of East Anglia lay an economy that dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. Ford's assembly lines at Willow Run would soon produce one bomber every hour. Douglas and Consolidated churned out Liberators by the thousands. In 1942 alone, the United States built 4 7,000 aircraft. In 1943, that figure climbed past 8,500. Factories stretched from Detroit to Seattle, powered by a workforce of millions men and women who had never seen Europe's skies but were fueling the arsenal that would overwhelm them. The doctrine guiding these young crews was equally bold. The United States Army Air Forces clung to the concept of precision daylight bombing, while the British Royal Air Force struck under cover of night-blanketing German cities in incendiary raids. The Americans believed that tightly packed formations of heavily armed bombers could strike key factories, refineries, and transportation hubs in daylight. The strategy promised to cripple the Nazi war machine surgically if it worked, but the gamble was immense. Each bomber carried 10 men, and each mission pushed them into skies guarded by the most experienced fighter corps in the world. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader units had perfected interception tactics. Flying Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, they slashed into bomber boxes from the front, exploiting blind spots, and broke away before the fortress guns could track them. Some units formed Sturmgruppen, bristling with 20mm and 30mm cannons designed to smash through even the flying fortress's armor. Above them, black curtains of flak tore holes in formations, scattering rookies into easy targets. In 1942 and 1943, the imbalance was stark. American formations that probed deeper into France or Germany often paid with horrific losses. One German ace later recalled with disdain how green American pilots would panic break formation and spiral helplessly toward Earth. After the twin disasters of Schweinfurt, Regensburg in August 1943 and the infamous Black Thursday raid in October when 60 bombers fell in flames, many in Britain doubted whether daylight bombing could survive at all. And yet, beneath this crucible of fire, the Americans adapted. Each defeat became a classroom. Gunnery schools in Britain drilled crews to cover every angle with their .50 caliber machine guns. Formation flying evolved into the combat box interlocking fields of fire that turned a squadron into a fortress of steel. Radar navigation and blind bombing aids improved accuracy. Every month, fresh waves of pilots crossed the Atlantic, trained not as lone duelists but as cogs in an industrial juggernaut. The Luftwaffe aces sneered at these factory pilots. To them, true skill was measured by the individual tally scrawled on a fighter's tail. Men like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny had become legends praised for their astonishing victory counts. But this very culture was a double-edged sword. Germany lacked a rotation system. Its experts flew until death or injury. Every fallen ace meant irreplaceable years of experience lost. By contrast, the Americans rotated crews home after 25 or 30 missions. Veterans trained newcomers, passing down lessons that multiplied rather than vanished. It was a system designed not for glory, but for endurance. Technology tilted the scales as well. The early escorts, stubby P-47 Thunderbolts and twin-tailed P-38 Lightnings, lacked the range to follow bombers to Berlin. German fighters simply waited near the limits of Allied coverage, then pounced on the unprotected formations. But by late 1943, a new machine arrived, the P-51 Mustang fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and long-range fuel tanks. At last, the Americans could provide cover from England to the heart of Germany. The Mustang was fast, agile, and deadly at high altitude. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare. Equally decisive was fuel. American refineries poured out aviation gasoline by the millions of barrels shipped across oceans in convoys and pumped into endless rows of bombers and fighters. German fuel derived from synthetic plants was already stretched thin. Each Mustang sortie not only shot down enemy fighters but also forced the Luftwaffe to expend irreplaceable gasoline. By 1944, German pilot trainees were logging fewer than 100 flight hours, barely enough to master takeoff and landing, while American rookies had flown double that before even leaving training bases. Behind these material factors loomed a deeper truth: the American war machine thrived on scale. Training schools across the United States churned out tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, gunners, and mechanics. Losses that would cripple a smaller nation were absorbed, studied, and answered with replacements. What Luftwaffe aces saw as weakness, naive boys with little combat sense, was in fact a renewable resource on a scale the Axis could not fathom. And so the stage was set for a collision, not of individuals but of philosophies. On one side stood the Luftwaffe aces, grinning with contempt, confident that their artistry in the skies would keep the Reich safe. On the other rose the rookie Americans, awkward at first, often bloodied but carried forward by the industrial tide of a nation determined to prove that no fortress was impregnable and no ace invincible. In the coming months, those smirks would fade. The Americans were not merely learning, they were multiplying. The skies over Europe were about to be transformed from a duelist's arena into a battlefield of overwhelming numbers, and in that transformation lay the doom of the Luftwaffe. The first real test of America's daylight bombing doctrine came not in glory, but in blood. When the 8th Air Force arrived in Britain, its numbers were modest, just a few hundred aircraft scattered across muddy airfields in East Anglia. The idea was simple: tightly packed combat boxes of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would punch through to the heart of Germany hammer factories, oil refineries, and U-boat pens, then return home under the protective umbrella of interlocking, 50 caliber machine guns. In theory, a box of bombers could defend itself. In practice, those boxes looked to the Luftwaffe like lumbering targets waiting to be ripped apart. From the start, the imbalance was obvious. American crews, many fresh from stateside training, had never seen the blinding flash of flak or heard the scream of cannon shells tearing into aluminum skin. Veterans recalled their first missions with a mix of awe and terror. The sky alive with black puffs, the acrid smell of cordite filling the fuselage, and the sudden bloom of fire as a bomber in the next formation disintegrated. To their German adversaries, men who had fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, these rookies were predictable prey. By mid-1943, the air war deepened. Determined to prove the validity of precision bombing, the Americans launched deep penetration raids into the Reich itself. One of the most daring came on the 17th of August, 1943, when 376 bombers set out to hit ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt and aircraft factories in Regensburg. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, guided by radar and ground controllers, swarmed the formations. Pilots attacked head-on, a terrifying maneuver that sent cannon shells ripping through cockpits before gunners could even open fire. Others used heavy Sturmgruppenfeuer, -190 seconds, armed with 20mm and 30mm guns to chew entire bombers into flaming wreckage. That day, 60 bombers never came back. Nearly 600 young Americans perished or were captured. The mission crippled German production only briefly, but the cost for the US was staggering. The Germans smirked and declared the American strategy suicidal. To them, daylight raids without constant fighter cover were madness. 2 months later came the blackest day of all. On the 14th of October 1943, the Americans tried Schweinfurt again. This time 291 B-17 seconds droned toward the target. The Luftwaffe pounced with everything it had. Over 1500 fighter sorties battered the formations while flak tore gaps in their ranks. For hours, the bombers lumbered forward under withering fire. Crews described watching entire squadrons disintegrate wings, torn away parachutes, blossoming in pitiful clusters before vanishing into smoke. By nightfall, 60 bombers were gone, over 600 men missing. Another 17 limped back so badly damaged they would never fly again. Only 33% of the force reached the target. The day went down in history as Black Thursday. In Britain, the press whispered that the experiment had failed. Loss rates of 20% per mission were unsustainable. At that pace, no crew could expect to complete the 25 sorties required for rotation home. Some units suffered casualty rates so severe that veterans looked around their mess halls and found half the chairs empty. Letters poured home with grim lines like, "If I don't make it, remember me with pride." And yet beneath the grief and horror, the Americans adapted. Each disaster became a lesson. Crews were drilled relentlessly on formation discipline. The combat box tightened its overlapping fields of fire, refined until it resembled a flying fortress in truth. Gunners practiced with endless belts of ammunition, learning to anticipate the head-on attacks and fire at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. Navigation improved with radar beacons and better coordination. Even the rookies, once ridiculed, grew harder, sharper, and more disciplined with every mission survived. Meanwhile, industry answered blood with steel. The same week that 60 bombers fell at Schweinfurt, American factories rolled out hundreds more. Replacement crews trained in vast fields in Texas and Kansas shipped across the Atlantic by the thousands. Where Germany lost an ace gone forever with his irreplaceable combat hours, America replaced rookies with more rookies, backed by a system that valued not individual scores, but the relentless tide of numbers. To the Luftwaffe it was infuriating. German pilots boasted of their kill counts, but the sky never seemed to empty. Every time they struck down a formation, another appeared the next month, larger and more determined. The veterans began to notice something unnerving the rookies were learning. The same green crews that once broke apart under pressure now held formation even as wings caught fire. Gunners scored more hits. Bomber boxes that once scattered began to claw their way through flak and fighters alike. By late 1943, both sides knew the balance was shifting. The Americans had suffered grievously, but they had not broken. Instead, they had absorbed the lessons in blood, hardened their doctrine, and prepared for the next phase. Deep in hangars in England, long-range fighters with sleek lines and Merlin engines were being painted with invasion stripes. The day was coming when the Luftwaffe aces would look up and no longer see vulnerable bombers, but an entire swarm of G.I.s filling the heavens. The turning point came in the first months of 1944. What had once been a duel between veteran German aces and frightened American rookies transformed into a storm of steel and contrails that even the most hardened Luftwaffe pilots could not believe. At the center of this transformation stood not a bomber, but a sleek new escort fighter, the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed in response to a British request, the Mustang only reached its true potential when fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the U.S. Army Air Forces possessed a fighter that could climb, turn, and dive with the best German machines, and most crucially had the range to fly all the way to Berlin and back. When strapped with drop tanks, the Mustang could shepherd bombers deep into Germany, chase enemy fighters away from the formations, and even strafe their airfields on the return trip. To the Luftwaffe, which had grown accustomed to pouncing on unescorted bombers just beyond the reach of thunderbolts and lightnings, this was a nightmare. In January 1944, leadership of the 8th Air Force passed to General Jimmy Doolittle, a man famous for leading the audacious Tokyo raid in 1942. Doolittle brought with him a new philosophy. No longer would escorts be chained to bomber formations waiting passively for German attacks. Instead, they were unleashed. P-51 seconds, P-47 seconds, and P-38 seconds were ordered to sweep ahead of the bombers hunting the hunters. If the Luftwaffe wanted to intercept the American waves, they now had to fight through aggressive swarms of escorts already in their skies. The impact was immediate. For the first time, the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive in its own airspace. German aces accustomed to dictating the terms of battle suddenly faced squadrons of nimble Mustangs diving out of the Sunday radio calls that once brimmed with confidence turned frantic. Achtung, Achtung, Feindjäger! Überall enemy fighters everywhere. February 1944 brought the test Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. Over 6 days, the Americans launched relentless raids against the German aircraft industry factories at Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, Stuttgart, and beyond. More than 3,800 bombers and 3,000 fighters took part. It was not a single hammer blow, but a pounding drumbeat that forced the Luftwaffe to rise again and again. For every sortie they burned precious aviation fuel, risking their irreplaceable aces against an enemy that only seemed to grow stronger. The losses were staggering. In those 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 600 fighters, destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Many of the men who had once laughed at American rookies never returned to their bases. The Americans suffered too. Roughly 250 bombers and 28 fighters were lost. But unlike the Germans, they could replace both machines and men within weeks. Factories in the U.S. rolled out aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Training schools shipped new crews across the Atlantic by the thousands. What Germany perceived as unsustainable losses were for the United States the grim but acceptable cost of a war of numbers. For the German people, the change was visible in the very sky. Contrails no longer traced thin lines, but wove thick curtains that blotted out the Sunday. Civilians looked up and saw hundreds, sometimes thousands of aircraft rumbling overhead, their engines shaking windows and rattling dishes. Where once Luftwaffe propaganda had promised invincibility, now German cities were left to watch helplessly as wave after wave of bombers flanked by sleek Mustangs crossed their rooftops. Luftwaffe pilots, even the most decorated, began to feel the pressure. Their replacements were no longer polished graduates of long training programs. With fuel scarce and time short, German trainees sometimes logged fewer than 100 hours before being thrown into combat. Against them stood Americans with nearly double the flight experience, armed with modern equipment, and backed by a doctrine that emphasized teamwork over personal glory. The psychological impact was devastating. Veteran aces who had once hunted at will now found themselves hunted in turn. Every attempt to intercept a bomber box risked being cut off and swarmed by escorts. Even airfields, once sanctuaries, came under attack, as P-51 seconds swept low to strafe parked fighters and fuel trucks. A Luftwaffe mechanic recalled the despair of watching entire squadrons destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. By the spring of 1944, the balance had decisively shifted. Where the Americans had once bled at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, they now struck at will. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely, but each battle consumed more of its dwindling strength. Oil refineries were bombed, reducing fuel supplies to a trickle. Factories were smashed or forced underground. Every ace killed represented not only a personal loss, but the evaporation of years of hard-won combat experience that could never be replaced. To the Americans, victory was still costly, but it was no longer in doubt. Every mission that returned, no matter how battered, proved the doctrine could work. Every contrail painted across the German sky was another reminder that America's industrial and human tide was swelling beyond control. Rookie crews still climbed into their bombers with fear in their hearts, but they did so surrounded by swarms of fighters that stretched horizon to horizon. The Luftwaffe could still kill, but it could no longer dominate. In the words of one German officer watching the endless formations pass overhead, "Es war, als ob die Luft von Amerika gefüllt wurde." It was as if the very air itself had been filled with America. The smirks were gone. In their place lay grim recognition. The age of the ace was ending. The age of the swarm had begun. The breaking point came in March 1944. For the first time, the Americans dared to do what had once seemed suicidal, send their bombers directly into the heart of Berlin, fully escorted from takeoff to target. On the 6th of March, over 600 bombers shielded by nearly 800 fighters thundered toward the Reich capital. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, throwing up more than 600 interceptors. To German civilians on the ground, the sky looked like a battle between entire nations rather than squadrons. Contrails slashed across the heavens in tangled webs, the sun obscured by the haze of smoke and fire. German aces dove with determination. Some, like the celebrated veterans who had once laughed at American rookies, still believed they could claw victory from overwhelming odds. But the rules of the air had changed. No longer were the bombers alone. P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts swept into the fight, diving, climbing, and rolling with such ferocity that even seasoned Luftwaffe pilots struggled to keep pace. Instead of attacking vulnerable formations, the Germans found themselves swarmed by escorts that seemed to come from every direction. Radio calls erupted in panic. "Achtung, Feindjäger auf 10 Uhr, 12 Uhr, überall enemy fighters at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock everywhere." For the first time, German voices carried something new: desperation. In the chaos, American bombers continued their steady march toward Berlin, bombs dropping on aircraft plants, rail yards, and industrial zones that had once been considered untouchable. The raid was costly. Dozens of bombers fell and American crews paid in blood. But it proved the unthinkable: the United States could strike the very heart of the Reich in daylight and return escorted every mile of the way. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its ability to shred bomber streams, had been forced to yield the sky over its own capital. The following months only deepened the nightmare for Germany. American planners knew that aircraft could be rebuilt, but without fuel, the Luftwaffe would wither. In May and June 1944, the Allies turned their attention to the oil fields and synthetic fuel plants, targets like Ploiești in Romania, and facilities scattered across Germany. Precision raids escorted all the way by Mustangs smashed storage tanks and refineries. Each blast tore more than steel. It tore the lifeblood from the Luftwaffe. By summer, German flight schools were forced to ration training hours. Pilots graduated with barely enough fuel to practice gunnery, let alone master combat maneuvers. The Americans knew the effect. Doolittle's strategy was not just to protect the bombers, but to annihilate the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. Fighters were ordered to attack not only in the air, but on the ground. Squadrons of P-51 seconds swept low over airfields, strafing rows of parked aircraft fuel depots, and even pilots scrambling to their cockpits. One German mechanic later remembered the horror of seeing dozens of Messerschmitts destroyed before they could lift off smoke pouring from shattered hangars. By June 1944, the air war reached its crescendo. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, depended entirely on air supremacy. On D-Day, the 6th of June, the Allies launched an aerial armada that dwarfed anything seen before, over 14,000 sorties in a single day. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, transports all filled the skies in a continuous roar. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but could muster barely a fraction of its once proud strength. Entire squadrons were grounded for lack of fuel. Others threw green pilots into the maelstrom only to see them shot down within minutes. The German Air Force that had once terrorized Europe with blitzkrieg was now a shadow of itself, swarmed and smothered by sheer Allied numbers. The change was visible to everyone. German civilians who once watched confident patrols of Messerschmitts overhead now looked up and saw the sky dominated by contrails that stretched horizon to horizon. Farmers, soldiers, even Hitler's generals knew the truth. Germany no longer controlled its own airspace. And for the Luftwaffe aces, the realization was bitter. They still fought bravely, some scoring victories even in the twilight of their service. But they could not fight arithmetic. Each Mustang shot down was replaced within weeks. Each fallen rookie gunner was replaced by another fresh face from Kansas, Ohio, or New York. The Americans seemed endless. The final humiliation came when German pilots realized they could no longer even take off without being hunted. In July and August, Mustang squadrons patrolled freely over France and Germany, pouncing on any aircraft that dared rise. The Luftwaffe was no longer an offensive force. It was prey. A German ace later admitted, "We could still shoot down a bomber or two, but it made no difference. The Americans came back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. They never stopped." The smirks that had once graced German faces in 1942 and 1943 were gone, replaced by weary resignation. The skies that had been their hunting ground were now hostile territory. The great duelists of Europe had met an enemy they could not outfly, outgun, or outlast the swarm of G.I.s backed by the unrelenting tide of American industry. By the summer of 1944, the war in the air was decided. The Luftwaffe's fate was sealed not by a single battle, but by the accumulation of hundreds of raids, thousands of sorties, and millions of gallons of gasoline that Germany could no longer produce. The Americans had achieved what once seemed impossible: total control of the skies. When the smoke cleared in the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been broken not by a single battle, but by an unrelenting campaign of attrition that consumed its machines, its fuel, and its most precious resource, its aces. The consequences reverberated across every front of the war. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on its cadre of Experten elite pilots who racked up astonishing victory counts. Men like Erich Hartmann or Gerhard Barkhorn became legends, their names whispered with awe even among their enemies. But in 1944, these legends were trapped in an impossible war of numbers. For every ace who brought down 10 or 20 American bombers, hundreds more crossed the skies the next day. Each kill was a drop of water against a tidal wave. Worse, every German pilot who fell was irreplaceable. Years of training and combat experience were lost in an instant, while his replacement often had fewer than 100 flight hours, barely enough to control his fighter in combat. The fuel crisis sharpened this decline. Allied raids on synthetic plants at Lohne-Politz and Mersburg cut production to a trickle. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe units were rationed to the point where many aircraft sat idle for weeks. Training schools collapsed. Cadets practiced taxiing on runways instead of flying. Some young Germans were sent into battle with no more than 20 hours of flight time, a death sentence against swarms of P-51 seconds flown by seasoned American pilots. The Luftwaffe was no longer an elite force. It was a desperate remnant flung into the skies to be slaughtered. Meanwhile, the Americans reaped the benefits of their hard-won supremacy. In Normandy, Allied troops stormed the beaches under the cover of an aerial shield so complete that German commanders could barely move reinforcements in daylight. Rail lines were bombed, relentlessly bridges collapsed into rivers, convoys were shredded by roving Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Soldiers on the ground looked up in awe at the endless streams of American aircraft, knowing that their lives depended on that dominance. One infantryman later said, "We owned the sky. That's why we could win on the ground." Strategically, the collapse of the Luftwaffe spelled doom for Hitler's Reich. Without air cover, German armies were naked against Allied armor and artillery. Tanks could be spotted and destroyed from above. Supply depots could not be hidden. Even morale cracked. German civilians who once cheered their aces now huddled in bunkers, praying for survival as bombers turned cities to rubble. The ripple effects reached deep into German leadership. Hitler had promised his people that secret weapons, the Me-262 jet, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, would turn the tide. But these wonders arrived too late and in too few numbers. Jets were grounded for lack of fuel. Rocket bases were bombed before they could reach full output. No miracle could compensate for the fact that the Reich no longer controlled its own skies. For the Luftwaffe's surviving aces, the war ended in bitterness. Many had once laughed at American rookies, dismissing them as poorly trained farm boys. By 1945, those same rookies, multiplied by the tens of thousands, had buried Germany's air force. The irony was brutal. The individual skill of the Experten meant little when faced with the arithmetic of industrial war. One German pilot admitted after the war, "We could win battles, but we could not win the war. The Americans were endless." The Americans, too, understood what they had achieved. The daylight bombing campaign had been controversial. Critics pointed to staggering losses in 1943, but by 1944 the strategy proved its worth. The destruction of German oil industry and transport systems crippled the Reich's ability to resist. The air supremacy that allowed D-Day to succeed was bought with the blood of thousands of young airmen who never returned. For every empty chair in an English mess hall there was a lesson learned, a tactic improved, and a resolve hardened. In the end, the Battle of the Skies over Europe became more than a clash of fighters and bombers. It was a contest of philosophies. The Luftwaffe had placed its faith in individual brilliance, in the heroics of the ace. The Americans placed theirs in mass production, teamwork, and relentless persistence. History proved the latter decisive. The age of the lone duelist was over. The age of industrial air power had begun. The legacy endures. The U.S. Army Air Forces emerged from the war as the most powerful air arm in the world, its doctrines and machines shaping the coming Cold War. The lessons of Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Big Week, and D-Day became textbooks for future generations. And the story of how rookie G.I.s, once mocked and underestimated, filled the skies until even the proudest German aces were stunned, stands as a testament to the power of resolve, industry, and numbers. What began with smirks ended with silence. The Luftwaffe had laughed, but in the end it was the Americans who owned the skies.